Most leaders not fail because they lack ambition. They fail because change remains theoretical.
We have spent tens of thousands of dollars on training and materials, and you're telling me that we don't even know what it is because you never got from aspirations to operations.
Real change starts in the brain.
Our brain has like a whole bunch of filters. 80% of our thinking is happening like below our nose, and that's unconscious.
Lisa Riegel is a 50% strategist, 50% change catalyst. She works with leaders to help them frame positive changes that engage employees, improve outcomes, and lead to greater fulfillment.
Most resistance is unaddressed fear.
That's principle.
If people resist, they are the problem.
If people resist, you haven't designed a theory of change and you haven't engaged them in that process. The policies shape change, but people make change. Leaders need to understand humans. They need to understand how the brain works.
This episode solves a common leadership problem. Leaders have aspirations, but they do not know how to operationalize change and support it so that it sticks. Most leaders do not fail because they lack ambition. They fail because change remains theoretical. Can you take us through a moment when you watched a leadership team realize this will not stick unless we change how people think and feel? What happened?
Sure. One of my favorite stories is I was doing a strategic plan with a district, and I asked them what their instructional model was. And the superintendent said, we do UDL, Universal Design for Learning. And so I said, okay, well, as we think about implementation and, monitoring, what do you see and what do you hear when people are UDLing it like crazy and doing a great job? Not one administrator at the table could answer that question. And then I said, well, let's ask the teachers what they think. And so we asked the teachers and they were like, oh, is that pillar thing we did a couple years ago? And I thought the superintendent's head was going to blow off his neck. He's like, we have spent tens of thousands of dollars on training and materials, and you're telling me that we don't even know what it is. And I said, yeah, because you never got from aspirations to operations. You never took the conceptual and made it clear. And so that actually was part of the impetus for my development of the 8C commitment framework, which has clarity as a real central element to it.
So there's always a sentence you hear that signals resistance, and either they just clearly didn't know or there was some resistance to it. What did you hear that told you that they were maybe facing something that they felt was compliance to them rather than commitment?
Well, I think they said, we have the posters and we have we've done, a lot of times what I hear from teachers is, well, we already do all that. So they don't have a clear vision of how what you're looking for is different than what's happening in the classroom. And so the biggest resistance I hear is, well, we already do all that, so I'm fine. I don't need to change, or I don't have time, or I don't know what you're asking. So those are the three main things that I hear from teachers.
So when change collapses, and this one didn't really collapse, but it more so just never really took off the way that the leader was hoping it would take off.
Mm-hmm.
That usually happens in a predictable place. What do you think this person should have done to actually help this land?
Well, I think the first thing was to have a vision of what it looks like when it's being implemented. I think a lot of leaders bring in training and kind of outsource the responsibility for teaching the staff what they need to do, and then there's no monitoring. So and then the other piece is coherence. They didn't situate the change within the current context, and so. In this particular case, they wanted universal design for learning, but they purchased curriculum that was widely direct instruction curriculum. So now teachers are going to fail either way, because if I follow the curriculum, I'm not doing the UDL and vice versa. So I think it's really a matter of clarity and coherence, and then kind of cadence for change. I think a lot of times we provide training, and sometimes I'm amazed when I've done trainings before how many times administrators aren't even in the training. They use that time to catch up on emails or things like that. And it's like, I can teach them the basics, but change requires consistency and pressure and celebration and collaboration and all of those other pieces. And if the leaders are not there to visualize and strategize about how they want to do that, then it becomes, I can get people excited and entertain them for an hour or a day or whatever, but the real change happens after I leave. And if that's not part of the strategy, then you're not going to see real implementation.
Okay, and later I want your 8 factors for transformative change, and I want you to teach how perceptions are formed in the brain,
Yep.
because that appears to be the missing layer in most change plans. But we'll get to that a little later in the show.
Okay.
Welcome back to the Elemental Educator. Today, I'm here with Lisa, a strategist and change catalyst who helps leaders frame positive changes that engage employees, improve outcomes, and lead to greater fulfillment. This episode solves a common leadership problem. Leaders have aspirations, but they do not know how to operationalize change and support it so that it sticks. If you remember one sentence from today, let it be this: real change starts in the brain. Lisa, thank you so much for joining me on the Elemental Educator podcast today. It is my pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
And we're going to jump right into our first segment called Grounded Moments.
3, 2, 1.
Policy can dictate direction, but it cannot generate ownership. And before coming on the show, I asked you to share a quote with me, Lisa, and the quote you shared was, "Policies shape change, but people make it happen." When did you learn that lesson in a way that you could not ignore it?
Good question. I learned that as a teacher when I had the pleasure of having a really strong leader and watched change happen. And then she left, and we had some other not so effective leaders, and I watched all of those changes unravel. And then when I was on a leadership team at a school, I watched a lot of breakdowns in the communication. And so when I went to do my doctoral work, I studied leadership, but I was really interested in the human system, the human side of change. And, I think a lot of leaders get very frustrated with the people they're leading because they don't see them making the changes that need to happen. But I kind of took a different perspective that that's not a problem with your staff, it's a problem with your leadership. And so that really kind of propelled me into the work that I do today.
If you could change one leadership habit that would make people drive change that lasts more likely in the way that we're talking about, what would it be?
I think that leaders need to understand humans. They need to understand how the brain works. They need to understand how stress impacts the brain and changes the stress. And so we have so many, and I taught leadership courses at Ohio State for a long time. They're all about org theory. They're about structure. They're about policy, but we really don't equip leaders with the information they need about people's brains, about why people are motivated, how people perceive the reality that they live in. And without that knowledge and skill set, a lot of principals have great intentions, but they aren't able to move the system.
So what is one thing that if I'm just starting as a leader, I need to know about brain behavior and leadership?
So I think a lot of us know that stress is a problem and we need to deal with impact of stress on work. But I think the really important thing is understanding how perceptions are formed, because my reality is different than your reality. And so I think a lot of times leaders will be like, well, I did this and they should know this. But when I talk to them about how the brain forms perceptions, and so if you think of our brain has like a whole bunch of filters, and 80% of our thinking is happening like below our nose, and that's unconscious. So there's a whole lot of action going on in our brain that we are not consciously thinking about, and those actions impact how we behave. So our behavior is really our biology and our context. And so if we understand the biology, we can reframe problems we see and we can plan for problems. if we shape a context that's safe and supportive and proactive, then we're going to be more successful at engaging the people in the system. So the way our brain forms a perception is that we have a part of our brain called the thalamus, and it's down in that limbic brain, unconscious, can't tell time, doesn't know a story. It's just looking at sensory associations in our environment. And so when we take in information from the environment, the job of that thalamus, I call him our data manager brings the data in, and the first thing he does is he goes into our sensory memory center, which is in our amygdala, also in that limbic system, and says, let's look for patterns. This is like what else? What else have we experienced that's similar? And if we've experienced things that our brain has aligned this data with negative emotions, then we end up with a stress reaction. So I always use, just to make it super simple to think about, pretend that reality is a banana, and you have all these filters like spaghetti strainers or colanders in your brain. So your thalamus is selecting which of those filters we want to run that banana through in order to have our perception. Well, if I shove a banana through a spaghetti strainer, it comes out the other side. It's still a banana, but it doesn't look like a banana. And every single individual has millions of filters, and the way their brain organizes those filters, it influences how they respond to the reality and how they perceive it. So from a leadership perspective, if you have a staff member who comes to you and says, Tyler's just always needling me. He never appreciates what I'm doing. He's constantly criticizing me. I can't work with him. A lot of times what the leader will try to resolve in that conflict is what happened. But when they start to understand how the brain perceives that, they start to realize the experience that Tyler's having is different than the experience that Lisa's having. And so maybe I come from a place of highly critical people. So when I hear feedback, that triggers a fear response in me that I'm not good enough, or, whatever that historical story of me and those filters are. And so rather, if the leader understands the biology beneath the behavior, then they could say to, they could say, hey, Tyler, the way that you're giving feedback, you love feedback. Your brain thinks feedback's a positive thing, and you take it in and soak it in, and it doesn't challenge who you are. For Lisa, the feedback challenges who she is. So we need to rethink how we are coaching her so that we are not making her feel like she is less than or making mistakes. And so that's just an easy example of how that brain perception impacts how we perceive our environment and what we need from our leaders. And we see it too with resistance to change. When you start thinking about why is the brain resisting this change, we're set up to resist change because change is novel and can be scary. So getting at that underlying why can make all the difference in the world for a leader.
What is an early indicator for people in leadership roles, but also people in followership roles, that would say, oh, I'm having a stress response to this scenario or this situation? Because one of the things that's being proactive on this is really, really difficult to catch, and it usually then leads to a confrontation. So what is an early signal people should be watching for?
Well, I think if they understand the nonverbals of stress for people, and that they're paying attention to the sort of temperature in the room. So there's an activity that I do with teacher teams and with admin teams, and it's called Name It, Own It, Control It. And it's basically an exploration of how we experience stress. And so I ask 3 questions. The first is, what does your body feel like when it's stressed? Because a lot of times the associations our brain is making are faulty. Like in the example with you giving me feedback, you're not trying to minimize my work.
Let me play it with you. So I feel tired.
Yeah, you feel tired.
Yeah.
Okay. So if you are feeling tired and then if you are feeling overwhelmed because you're tired, so you're not really ready to do deep thinking, then I, as a principal, need to understand that right now is not the time to hammer you with a huge to-do list. Maybe it's time for us to have a conversation about what I can do to help energize you, or why are you so tired? And in fact, yesterday, I was at a school and we had a teacher team. We were going through some student culture survey results, and they weren't good for this team of teachers. And the principal, who has worked with me, and we've talked a lot about this, and she said, I don't think that we should really get into action steps with this team, she said, I am sensing that they are really, really stressed right now. And so she opened the conversation to say, hey, I've taken the temperature on your team and I feel like there's a lot of stress going on. So let's talk about that first. Why is that stressful? And I mean, we had tears, we had, just a lot of resistance to, I'm overwhelmed, I can't get things done. And so I think being a leader that's looking at like the human side of like, what does your team need to be calm? Because we don't think when we're not calm. And so that's kind of trying to just take that temperature and then respond to the needs of the group. And sometimes that means you have to pivot a little bit from what you're doing, or you have to give people a chance to vent before you go through and try to start hammering action steps. Give them a moment to release the tension.
And recognizing you need to pivot and actually pivoting are
Yes.
two completely different things, where one is significantly harder than the other because there's a sense of pride in, no, I said I was going to do it this way. I want to see it through this way,
Right.
versus having to acknowledge that and move it on for people. So with that, many leaders are convinced that they are being clear and their teams will quietly disagree. And as you said, that tension builds up. Your hill to die on is that decisions require clarity, and leaders often cannot define the desired state. So, why is clarity so difficult for leaders who are otherwise competent?
Well, I think clarity is difficult, especially you think in a school, because you've got different grade levels, different subject levels. So the change that you're asking is going to be different in different locations. And I think that schools really like uniformity. And so they'll say, okay, here's what we're doing. And I was clear. And here's what you have to do in your classrooms. But they don't recognize the wide variety of contexts that they're
Mhm.
talking about. And so one of the things I talk about in my book is how to have effective collaboration and consensus building. So the leader gets to say, these are the non-negotiables. We are doing X, right? So I always use a highway analogy. You get to build the road because you're the leader and you're the one that's telling them where we're going. But then you have an opportunity to make those guardrails really wide or really narrow. And if you have an overly stressed staff who's maybe not as experienced, you might need to narrow those up and give them a little bit more concrete direction. If you have a really efficacious staff that has the capacity to do what you're doing, you can open that up a little bit. And I think also from a coherence perspective, like, what are you already doing that's similar that could be tweaked? So like I'm working with a district where we talked about this year is not about new things. It's about aligning, refining, and redesigning. And so it's not now there's this new initiative that we're going to throw on the plate, and then you have to figure out how to wedge it into what you already do.
Okay, so give me a practical method if a leader wants clarity before deciding. What is your process to define the desired state in plain language?
Okay, so what I do is start with tell me what you want. So, for example, I had a school that said, well, we want more small group work. We want data driven, differentiated small group work. And I said, okay, that's a word salad with a lot of different buzzwords. So, what does that mean? And so we got that from conceptual language to concrete. And the concrete language was 3 to 5 days out of a week, students will be put in small groups and groups will be determined by data. And so that is much more visible. And then I said, okay, now you've got people who are doing 99% whole group instruction, completely not differentiated at all. So you're asking them to make a giant leap from what they're currently doing to your vision. So let's develop some stepping stones along the way. Because I think the method now, even if they have clear language, is okay, this is what we want. We're going to call somebody in to do training. Now you've got the training, do it. And we don't think about the fact that we're literally asking people to, pole vault over a canyon to get from current state to desired state. So developing some of those stepping stones. So like, for example, for that school, it was move your desks. That's step one. Move your desks so group work can happen and put kids in groups 3 times a week. We knew that the groups would not be very effective, that teachers would complain that they couldn't get to everything. Now they're just teaching the same thing 4 times. But they took that first step, so we celebrated it. The next step is maybe instead of giving nonsense work to the kids who aren't with you, you could start to give them a little bit more strategic work when they're working independently in their groups. And then that's the next step. Then maybe all of a sudden you're like, why am I teaching the same thing 4 times? Maybe if I use data, I could divide these kids up and teach different things each time. And then the fourth step was maybe I could also offer some choices or differentiated work for students when they're not working in my small group. So it was giving them, it's that zone of proximal development, little steps along the way. And then we identified what are the barriers for each of these steps. Well, the first step is I'm a teacher who's never had to deal with transitions. So transitioning kids between groups is a skill. If I'm trying to go to the one where I'm dividing into data-driven groups, I have to be able to access the data, read the data, understand the data. So there's a lot of kind of sub-knowledge that teachers needed. So we created a mitigation plan to help teachers identify where are you in that pathway, and then what do you need, and how can we have peer-to-peer coaching and teaching for teachers who already know how to do some of these things to help build capacity as a whole.
And we'll revisit that scenario when we talk the adversity piece, because that subtle piece of moving the desk, repeating for 4 times, there is going to be a period of frustration there that I want to hear more about. But I want to shift before we get there to our first game. So this game is called Principle or Preference. I'm going to read a statement, and all I need from you is if this is a principle, which means it's something core, and not only should you adopt it, but everybody should adopt it, or it's a preference, meaning it's okay if not everybody follows suit with this. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, so it is rapid fire. There's no time to justify. Principle or preference, clarity is more important than speed.
That is principle.
If people cannot repeat the goal does not exist.
That is principle.
Change fails more from emotion than from strategy.
That is preference.
Compliance is the enemy of commitment.
That is principle.
Leaders should name trade-offs explicitly.
That is preference.
If the desired state is vague, the plan will become political.
That is principle.
Good communication is a design problem, not a personality trait.
That's probably principle too.
And I got a couple more here. Most resistance is unaddressed fear.
That's principle.
Teams change faster when they feel safe to be wrong.
Principle.
Sustained change requires reinforcement, not inspiration.
That would be principle.
And there we go. So if a leader adopted only one of those statements for the next 90 days, which would most improve their change outcomes and why?
I think that if they already have clarity, then I think understanding that change is really about fear. If they don't have clarity, everything falls apart. That's the foundation for any kind of change.
I like that. Let's go back earlier to when we were talking origin and the purpose of the why behind things. And let's get into your origin. So this game, I'm going to try to guess the first job you ever had. So what I want you to do is think of your very first job, paying job, I should say, because I think people do a lot of free jobs around their house if they are younger and doing chores. I have been on a streak of not getting any of these right. So I'm going to do my best here to get one right. Do you have your first job in your mind there?
Do you mean my first adult job or when I was a kid?
Ever. Your first job ever. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
You got it?
Yep.
All right. My 2-minute time, I get 2 minutes here. I'm going to start it now and we'll see if I can get there. And I got to do better than what I've done before. Okay. Sorry, I'm just pep talking myself here because I have been not good at this lately. Okay. Did teamwork matter in your job?
Yes.
Okay. Was your job inside or outside?
Inside.
Inside. Okay. Was it seasonal work? Could you only do it in part of the year?
No.
Okay. Did you have to wear a uniform?
No.
Okay. Was it a service you were offering for a company or for individuals?
Company.
Okay. How old were you when you had your first job?
14.
Okay. Um, did it involve a consumable?
Yes.
Okay. Was it a catering service?
No, but
Okay.
close.
Okay, I'm super close on this. You worked at like a coffee shop inside or like a food service shop though?
Yes.
Okay. Is it like a brand that it would be a popular brand?
No.
Okay. Like a local coffee shop?
Very yes. Yes.
Oh, very, very yes. So like were you like a barista?
No.
Okay. Am I on the right theme here of coffee shop or we're hesitating?
Yes, you are on the right theme. I'm just old and we didn't have baristas then. We
Okay.
didn't make
Okay. You were a hostess at a local restaurant.
um not a hostess.
A server?
Yes.
You were a server. There we go. At a local restaurant. What was the name of the restaurant?
It was my mom's bakery and it was called the
Oh,
bakery. And
there we
so it
go.
was breakfast. So we did have coffee and things, but mostly it was like a counter type shop.
I'm checking that as a win
You
in
win.
my
You
columns.
win.
And for everybody listening, I still had 30 seconds left on this one. And the biggest feedback I've been getting is I suck at this game. And now they can't say that because
Nope.
I won the game. So
You did.
there we go. What I want to know is when you worked there, what did it teach you about how humans respond to pressure and incentives?
Well, I think I might have been a little young at that point to really learn those lessons, but I know that, if you work at a bakery, like they're there at 4 a.m. So you talk about tired, you mentioned earlier I'm tired, just being able, I mean, especially in food service, it is truly like you've got to be a like well-oiled machine so you're not getting in each other's way. And I think the other thing that I really learned there was about talking to people and like making people feel good about their day because a donut or a croissant, while I will say we had an amazing pastry chef, it's just food. Really, when you think about the experience of what made our bakery successful, it was the relationships that we had with the people who came in and how we treated them and remembered their names or remember what they order or just giving them a, hey, have a nice day, some of those positivity things. And so I think one of the things I learned in the many jobs I had and in my young life was just the power of kindness and the power of being curious and interested in people. Like I would sit and talk to people at the counter who, what do you do? And I would be genuinely interested in their lives. And I think people, they like to have a sense that people find them interesting.
And as soon as you take a relational approach to it, decisions are easier to make collaboratively, but
Mhm.
still where you hold that final answer because you've built the connection where they start to have an understanding of who you are as a human.
Right.
And we're naturally crafted to empathize with people and to try to understand where people are coming from. Where if that connection's not built, it leads to I don't know you, I'm disagreeing with you as a safety mechanism, right? As we've talked about earlier. Now, I want to get into those teachers with the desks that they moved every day and taught the same lesson 4 times and how we got through that frustration. So let's jump into headwinds and tailwinds and get into our adversity segment. Many leaders have chapters they rarely discuss because it does not fit the professional narrative. You've said you were on the wrong path in your 20s and you made a major shift. What was the moment you knew you had to start over?
So I graduated with an English literature degree. So I was in tech sales. And I ended up in a job where I was selling automatic greasing systems for semis and off-road construction equipment, which was hilarious because I came from the suburbs and had never even seen this equipment before. And I did okay at the job. I made money and I was successful. And I'll never forget, I was on my way out to some truck yard in the middle of nowhere, and I was walking down my steps of my house, and my roommate had this like feng shui thing. So we had mirrors and in places to, make the energy good. And I just caught a glimpse of myself in that mirror, and I was like, what am I doing? Like, I don't care if anybody buys grease, and I can't come down these stairs for the next 30 years. I just don't care. And so I quit my job. I was also supposed to get married, and I quit that. I decided I didn't really have the right person either. So I kind of blew my whole life up, put a backpack on, and I went to Florida and just walked around like Forrest Gump, just walked around for like 2.5 weeks and just said, who am I? Like, what is going to align my values and my interests and my passions in my work? And so I decided I wanted to work with kids and I wanted to teach. And so I came back and got my teaching degree and then started in education. And it's been great ever since. But I wish more people would have that. I call it my quarter life crisis because it really gave me a chance to align my values, and it's made me much happier because I think, when you're living your values, you feel a sense of purpose.
Starting over usually requires admitting something painful. Looking in that mirror, what did you have to admit to yourself first?
I think the biggest thing I had to admit was that I was on somebody else's path. I came from a very highly critical family, very successful family. My dad was an infertility specialist. I grew up where you come home with an A minus and it was what happened. It was just a very achievement oriented family. And so my vision of success was you get a job, you get a, company car, you make a lot of money, you get things, and that made you successful. And so it was a very difficult thing for me to realize that that was my family's vision for me, not my vision for me.
Hmm.
And then it was hard to realize, like, I hope I don't disappoint them, but that's not the vision that I need in my life. And so that was really that kind of realization that smacked me in the face as I was living for somebody else and I was miserable.
And how did the people around you respond when you made that decision?
They were shocked when I just quit everything and I just said, I can't keep going on like this. So I'm going to take a hard stop. And this was before we had like everything, like you could pay all your bills online. So I remember I called my mom and I said, I'm going to go away for a little bit, just for a few weeks. And I said, here's money. Can you help make sure my bills get paid while I'm gone? And she was just like, what are you doing? And I said, I've got to do a hard reset, and I'd rather do it now than when I'm 50 and I've got
Right.
kids and a family and things like that. And so I think they were initially super shocked because I was a pretty compliant kid. I did what I was told. But then I think they really were proud of me and they celebrated that I was going to step out and make my own path.
Hmm. Leaders often treat perception as a communication problem. You treat it as a brain problem. So, with that scenario, going back to those teachers with the desks and the repeating instruction,
Mhm.
let's talk maybe how perception formed in the brain and why do they shape everything about change?
So in that particular example, one of the perceptions that I think forms, so those filters in your brain form through repetition, experience, and emotion. And if you think of the life of a teacher, they are absolutely inundated with conversations around getting through the curriculum, around student growth, around data. And so they have a perception that if I am not running a million miles an hour, I'm not a good teacher, and that they have to get through their content, and that makes them a good teacher. And we have reinforced that through the way that we celebrate and the way that we, you think about how many meetings we focus on outcome data rather than what I call output data, which is what the adults are doing in the system. And so teachers were very frustrated because they felt like they were failing. So the fear wasn't about change. The fear was about my vision of what good teaching is being shaken and I don't want to fail. And so that was the fear. And so the leaders in that building had to do a lot of celebration, a lot of positive language, a lot of, hey, let's notice that the kids are smiling. Hey, let's notice that this kid who never participates is now doing something. Let's notice that maybe you didn't get through as much curriculum right now, but the kids are getting it and they're actually, going to learn this and retain it. And so we had to shift the way that we were coaching them and helping them to feel like what they were there was a new model for what good teaching was going to look like. And I talk a lot about teacher that, if you think of a pie graph, teacher beliefs, behaviors, and identity are all equal parts of this pie graph. And so when we ask them, a lot of times what we do is go in and ask them to change their behaviors, and they resist because the behaviors they have are congruent to their identity and their belief of good teaching. So a good leader has to find a way to sort of tear that behavior part of that pie apart so that there's a space. And then when there's that space, teachers are going to feel dissonance because they're going to be like, I'm a good teacher and I believe in, good teaching and the values of teaching and all this other stuff. And now I'm being shown that the behaviors I'm doing are not aligned with those beliefs and those values. So now they want to find a solution to bring that circle back together.
And, what is one thing that a leader can do next week to actually help shape those perceptions?
I think part of it is, well, the perception of change. I think part of it is having some good conversations. Like I teach leaders to do a strategy matrix that really brings together conversation. It's a collaborative process with their teams, and they go through and they honor what they currently do, and they look at what are the strengths and weaknesses of that, and they find a way to situate the new into a regular evolution of that work as opposed to a new thing. So I think that helps shape the perception because it reduces the fear of now I have this whole new thing I have to do. I don't know how to do it. I don't know if I'll be good at it. And then that challenges my sense of self. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing that is really underrated in education and in the workplace in general is celebration, authentic celebration. When you give somebody a challenge and then you celebrate when they try it, and you give people opportunities to tell their success stories rather than their stress stories.
There's like a stigma to the celebrations in education. It's weird. Like we want to be recognized for doing great things, but we also don't want to be recognized when we're in education.
Yeah.
It's a catch-22, and that's a hard thing to navigate. And a little earlier, just speaking towards perceptions of what is a win, right? And what is actually success in a scenario. And yeah, that's a conversation I've had more often than I would have hoped to have, because we have these kids, even teachers that aren't progressing at the same pace as everyone else,
Mhm.
and we look at that and think it's a problem, versus just looking at that and saying this is a human, and they are supposed to be different than the other humans around them. We
Mhm.
shouldn't be expecting every human to grow and act and function at the same rate, but yet we're mad when they don't.
Right.
So that's such a difficult scenario that is very real in almost every education setting. It can
Mhm.
also be real in just business management settings. How do we work with leaders and people that struggle to maybe understand that people are always going to be at different levels?
Right. And I think that is a key problem is that we expect, and it's an irony really, because we expect teachers to differentiate for students, but leaders don't differentiate for their teachers.
Mhm.
And so one of the things that I do with leaders is an aptitude attitude matrix. And we look at what are some reasons for resistance to change. Is it a skill-based thing? Is it a fear-based thing? Is it truly I'm just not on board with this, it's the hill I want to die on thing? And the way we coach is different depending on what that reason is. And the other thing, once we look at the staff and we think about the capacity and the willingness of the staff, we have those stepping stones, but then the next step is to say, okay, what's the cadence of change? And so maybe you provide the stepping stones to the staff and you say, okay, the goal is by the end of the first semester, 100% of us are going to be operating at step 1 and 50% of us are going to be operating at step 2. And if we've
Mhm.
got people at step 3 or step 4, then great. And now you have something you can monitor, because if it's observable behaviors you're looking for, you can actually monitor, hey, last month I did some walkthroughs and we were operating about 60% at step 2. This month I came through and we're up to 80%. So you can do authentic, real celebrations that give celebrations for the effort versus we're all working so hard on this new change, so we're going to have a lunch, or I put lollipops in your, mailboxes or things. Those are celebrations that just fall flat because they're not authentic and tied to the actual behavior change that you want to see.
Right. Okay, let's put you in the hot seat. I'm going to give you a scenario, and
Mhm.
in 10 seconds or less, I just want your first move to how you would address some adversity that's getting thrown your way. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, so staff are compliant in meetings, but undermining change in private. What's the first move?
First move is to create a consensus process in those meetings that forces each person to verbally consent to the change.
Okay. A team is exhausted and reacts negatively to any new initiative. What would be the first move?
I think it would be to allow them to articulate why they're exhausted and then figure out if you can position the change as a way that reduces the workload.
Okay. And your leadership team cannot agree on the desired state.
Then there's a hill we want to die on process. So going through and looking at the why can't we agree? Is this just you say tomato, I say tomato, or are there fundamental differences to what we're actually talking about? And addressing those fundamental differences first, and then being able to, because I think we get mired sometimes in the language and then people tune out because they don't like the word you picked versus do we all agree with sort of the spirit of what we're trying to do? And if not, a lot of times those folks that are resisting have a good point. We've
Mhm.
gotten into groupthink and we think we're going the right direction. So I think also resisting the urge to make those people the negative, negative Nellies of the group.
An influential staff member becomes a resistance center. What do you do?
So first, you have a conversation. If you've done a consensus, you can say, hey, we agreed to this, so help me understand what's getting in your way. Second, I think elevating people to peer coach roles who are successfully doing the change and also have good relationships, because that high quality staff member is used to being considered one of the best. And when they start to see other people being recognized for the concrete changes that are being made, it shatters their sense of, hey, wait a minute, I'm supposed to be the superstar. And sometimes that can be sort of an ego driven way for them to say, well, I can do this. Well, then, okay, go ahead and do it.
Mhm. And you have data that supports change, but people do not trust the messenger. What's your first move?
I think that if you have data that is, a lot of leaders focus on outcome data. If you have output data, you have data that is what you see and hear that the humans are doing in the system that backs your theory of change. Like, we're going to do small group. I've now measured whether we're doing it or not. I think that helps to build trust in the data, because test scores, there's 5,000 million trillion variables that impact test scores, and we're one of them. So if you have adult fidelity data to say, we did this, and this is what we believe that this lever actually had power to move this data, then you get a little bit more buy-in from the data.
One of the things that not we, that you brought up in this game was the hill to die on. And at what point does that hill to die on actually lead to we're not a good fit on this team together and one of us now needs to go?
Yeah. And that's a really difficult conversation. And so I talk to leaders about, having some coaching sessions and, letting teach, especially in teaching, you're the king of your castle in teaching. You go in, you shut your door, you're the ultimate boss. And so sometimes there's a little bit of resistance to the idea of being told what to do or having, oversight that is not just conceptual, but, they're in your classroom. They want to see that you're doing this. So I think some of it is having those conversations about, we are going this direction because it's what's good for kids. If you've done a consensus building shared decision making model, then they've had voice in it at some point.
Mhm.
And then if that's not what they want, then you have to make them uncomfortable enough for the change. So sometimes people resist change because they're afraid of it. Sometimes they resist it because they're comfortable where they are. And sometimes they resist change because they are in a completely different mindset of what their purpose should be. And so, addressing the, either you're getting on the bus, you don't get to make that decision. If you want to make that decision, go get your license and be a leader, and then you get to shape the change in a different way. But giving them support first, and then not moving the goalposts. I see a lot of times, principals will come out with like, this is what I want to see. And then when the staff isn't doing it, it starts to chip away. And all of a sudden now there is no expectation anymore. And then the
Mhm.
people who were the early adopters are annoyed because they're like, I did all this work to move this forward. And now all of a sudden she doesn't have to do it. So I think holding that line is really important. Starting with support, starting with understanding. Why are you resisting this? Get to the human side of it. What's going on in your head that's making you dig your heels in, but then also the message of this is not negotiable. So maybe this isn't the right place for you anymore. If this is what, and I think a lot of times too, if you have a high performer and you put them on an improvement plan, that is uncomfortable for them. And so, kind of sticking to your guns and saying this is the move we're making. And if it doesn't work, and if we're collecting data on the adult behaviors on our theory of change that this is going to impact student success, if we do this for 6 months and we don't see those metrics move, then maybe our theory of change is wrong and maybe you're right. But we can't know that unless we do the change with fidelity so that the experiment is accurate.
So many follow-up questions that I have to that. And I'll maybe just go to one here. How would you respond to the general public looking at that and saying, why are we experimenting on people's lives?
But I think all change is an experiment, right? We have a theory of change. We think, even in a business that says, hey, we want more website hits. So we're going to try something. We're going to experiment with it and see if it yields what we want. Medicine's the same way. We want you to be healthier. So let's experiment with this treatment and see if it has the intended impact. Perfect example in education is the science of reading. They finally aligned teaching with brain science on how our brain learns to read. And now it's okay, now we have to experiment with different tactics in our setting to see what works. And those tactics are aligned to the brain. So we believe that we should get better results from that. But anytime you try something new, you're experimenting with a new approach. And then you refine it. Once you've experimented and you say, hey, here's the good stuff that worked. Here's the stuff that, even though that book told me this was the way to do it, it's not working in my classroom. So now I'm going to tweak that. But to me, I think that's the key problem with education is we're afraid to experiment. We just take what we do traditionally and then we chomp around the edges to try these little things without saying fundamentally we need to do some shifts in what's happening in education. And there's going to be a period of time where we're not 100% sure what the impact's going to be.
So another quick game for you here. I will say a belief that I've heard that leaders repeat, and you have to rewrite it into something that you would teach. You have to flip the script on this, okay?
Okay.
If people resist, they are the problem.
I would say if people resist, you haven't designed a theory of change and you haven't engaged them in that process.
Once you announce change, it will happen.
Once you announce change, you hope it will happen. It will only happen if you have a strategy for both the planning, the engagement, and the sustainability of that change.
Clarity means having all the answers.
Clarity means being concrete so that you can see and hear what you are intending to have happen. And that way you can make adjustments if needed.
Culture is soft. Strategy is real.
Culture requires strategy. To build a positive culture, you have to be just as strategic about how you are managing and celebrating the humans in the system.
And fear-based urgency is the best motivator.
Fear shuts down our executive functions, which makes us less productive, less emotionally intelligent, and less able to actually make change. So fear is the antithesis of the pathway to change.
And there we go. Let's flip the script. Talking about change, let's just jump right into our third segment, our water segment, and let's get into ripples of change. AI is forcing organizations to confront gaps they could previously ignore. You redesigned a priority framework to help an organization proactively address the gaps in AI that will create in schools and in the workforce. What problem were they not seeing clearly until you reframed it?
So I think it kind of goes back to what I was just saying about we never give up what we're doing in education. So we just keep adding more stuff. And when you think about, I think right now education's in a real purpose crisis. So, originally it was to make Renaissance men, right? Or Renaissance people, where we know a little bit about everything because information wasn't accessible to everybody. And so that's when we have subjects and we have content and all of this information that we transmit in schools. But in the internet world and now in AI world, content isn't king, but we're still doing it. Then we said, okay, well, then what's the purpose of school? And then we said, okay, well, it's workforce development. So we're going to develop credentialing pathways and career pathways and all these things. Well, I just heard something the other day that said 60% of the jobs that will exist in 10 years currently don't exist and will be in reaction to AI infusing into the workforce. And so those pathways now, we've spent all this money on pathways and they're pathways to nowhere, a lot of them for kids. And so now we're in this moment where we're like, okay, so we don't really need content to be successful because we always have it in our pocket and have it accessible. We don't necessarily build career pathways because nobody really knows what they're going to look like at the moment. So what's our purpose? And so we said our purpose is to situate kids so they can be successful in a post-AI world. So what do they need? Well, we need the human part. We need the thinking skills, the emotional intelligence. And we talk about that in schools, but we don't actually measure it and strategically build it. And so in this school, we identified what are the skills that we need to be successful humans, not just successful workers or successful students, but successful humans. And we created a list of those things. And then we said, okay, how are we positioning those? How are we teaching them? How are we assessing them? And it was interesting. I had a meeting with the high school team and I said, we need to define critical thinking. Because again, what's the clarity around this? You say it, I say it, we're never going to get there if we don't have a definition. So we spent 2 hours and they could not come up with a definition for critical thinking. And so I'm like, we've talked about critical thinking for 25 years and we've watched it decline and we still don't have a definition. So I think that the purpose of schools in this moment is really being challenged. And I read an article the other day that said we don't have a student engagement problem. We have a student relevance problem because the things that we're doing in school are not going to be relevant for them to be successful human beings because they have devices and technology that can help them do that. So we're in a real shift right now. And I think it's exciting, but it's also a really terrifying time to be a school leader or a teacher.
And you said it right out of the gate on this question that leaders, they don't need more inspiration. They need a design for change that holds under stress. You
Yes.
said that there's 8 factors leaders must plan for when driving transformative change. Can you walk me through these 8?
Sure. So the first one's culture, and that's really the human side, right? Building trust, building collective efficacy, having a workplace that's safe and supportive where people can come and take risks. Then there's 3 planning C's, and we've talked a lot about them today. There's clarity, coherence, and cadence. Then once you've got your plan and you start to move the change, then there's 2 engagement C's, and that's collaboration and coaching. We talked a little bit about coaching, but collaboration's another big one because just putting adults in a room with some general concept of change doesn't yield productive work. So really learning how to structure that collaboration so that there's autonomy, but also accountability. And then there's 2 C's that are related to sustainability, and those are celebration and communication. And so as a leader, I see leaders that are really good at 1 or 2 of the C's, but the system falls apart because you really have to attend to all 8 of them in a strategic way. And they can work together. But when you have all 8 of them really strategic, working well, you can make transformation stick and you can make people happy about the process getting there.
So I was just going to ask if a leader had to focus on 1 or 2 of these, maybe they recognize that there are other ones they're stronger at, but they're weakest ones. Which 2 do you find people struggle with the most?
I think the hardest ones for people are culture and clarity.
Okay.
Culture, we go to culture and we like posters and words and frameworks and things like that, but that's not culture. Culture is not words, it's action. And so how are you orchestrating that that we are doing the actions that make that culture a lived experience. And I think that we give a lot of lip service to culture, but we don't actually know how to develop. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier. We don't train principals on how to work with people, how to understand people, and culture is a people construct. And then the second one is that clarity. It is amazing to me how difficult it is for leaders to really operationalize what they want to see happen.
I think that comes all the way back down to how we train teachers to deal with classroom management and behavior. I remember
100%.
I remember being in my undergraduate, and we laugh back at these moments now, but there was a class called um, managing behavior,
Yeah.
or the teacher presence, and we practiced a teacher look, and we practiced proximity to kids, and we
Yeah.
practiced getting down on their eye level. And it's funny because I laugh at that for two reasons, and the first one is being the teacher look has never bailed me out of a situation that was going horribly wrong,
Yeah.
and neither has proximity, and neither has getting down on their level.
Right.
Um, they need to go so much farther in those classes because they're doing such a disservice to what's actually happening in education, and I
Yeah.
don't think that that's truly understood. But it did getting to their level, and that just general idea. I've always held on to that one, and it's put me in that position to build that connection and have that understanding, because we also have leaders, and I'm guilty of it too, of saying we can't really teach how we manage a class. You either can or you can't. We can teach how you plan a lesson and deliver a lesson, but to have the relationship is something that's not teachable. And I'm starting to shift my thought on that and think it is potentially something that can become teachable, but
Yeah.
it requires the learner to put in a significant amount of effort to
Yeah.
become good at it. So,
Well, I think it requires us to understand how people work, how they think. And I always tell teachers, when you understand behavior as biology and context, you reframe the problems in front of you because you
yeah.
notice the behaviors of students, and it gives you a very different perspective on why they're behaving that way and how you can be an ally to them versus classroom management, which is about compliance and control.
And with that, I think we've talked a lot about change. It's time to get into our last element, our deciding element. Let's get in to spark or burn. You left the comfort of full time employment to pursue your doctorate without knowing how you would fund your family, and you built a consulting business in the process. What made you decide it was worth the risk?
So I would say I am very lucky to have a husband who is very supportive. And so and this was back in I think it was like 2008 or whatever. It was when everybody was losing their jobs. And so here I am in this job full time, not happy because I had a horrible leader, by the way. And I got this opportunity and I called him and I said, okay, so I got this opportunity, but it means I have to leave my job and I'm going to end up like the graduate student. You get paid like $12,000 a year. It's like gas and parking money for Ohio State. And I said, I'll be a barista. I'll work wherever to help make ends meet. But would you be okay for me doing this? He didn't even blink. He said, do it. This is your dream. Do it. Money isn't, what we need. We'll figure it out. And so I think having that support gave me the confidence to do that. And then I think all the way back to my days at the bakery, I learned to be interested in people and curious. And, I'm a smart person, so I can figure things out. So I just said yes. And I had a really great network of people that started hiring me to do different kinds of things. And I would just say, hey, I'm doing some consulting work while I'm in my graduate work. And I never advertised. It just sort of grew. And I did all kinds of crazy stuff during that time. But what was cool was that at the time, I didn't see how all those dots were lining up. But now in my career, I look backwards and it was all this winding path to kind of get me where I am today and the interests and passions and knowledge that I have to share. So I think for me, it was really, I give a lot of credit to my husband for giving me the okay that we can suffer a little if we have to. And then I think I'm a very driven person and I'm not afraid of risk. And so if you're going to be a consultant, you have to not be afraid of risk because nothing is stable when you're a consultant.
Mhm. What did you learn about decision making under uncertainty that leaders can apply to change work?
Um, I think that if you start with a value or a reason for the decision that is aligned with your context. So if you're looking at, hey, we have, this problem that we know we have, whether it's a discipline problem or an academic problem, um, here are 3 or 4 different things we can do, and then you commit to a decision. I think you feel better about it when it's aligned. And the other thing I would say is that one of the things I talk about is there's 4 different ways to talk. So there's like dialoguing, there's discussion, there's data debriefs, there's directives. All 4 of those ways of talking have very different purposes. And I don't think that we do enough dialoguing. And dialoguing, the purpose is to understand. And so, I've been in meetings with people where it's like you get a couple loud voices, they come up with, well, we'll do this, this, and this. And then you get halfway down implementation and you're like, we should never have done this. So I think making sure that your decisions are fully thought out, that they have voice from other people so that you don't get yourself in a rabbit hole and think something's going to work and not think about the contextual things that are going to prevent it from working. Then I think you make better decisions. And if you've included people and gotten their voice in the decision-making process, then you're going to have more of a commitment when you actually start to implement.
What you're describing right there is essentially clarity.
Yeah.
How do leaders know when they have enough clarity to act?
Yeah, I think if you do a good dialogue and you get all that information, when you then take all that information and you create, like, here we have option A, option B, option C, as far as what we can do moving forward. If you bring that to a team and the team discusses logistics, then you've made a good decision. If you get it to a team and they discuss theoretical or philosophical or value driven objections, you haven't done enough dialogue at that point. And I
And
think
that's gonna
everybody needs to rush, like slow down a little bit. Like it's okay to slow down because when you slow down in the planning, you speed up in the implementation.
and that's gonna be the hardest part is I was just gonna say is slowing down
Yeah.
to make sure that you give it time, right? And so, uh, at the time of us recording this, I just gave a presentation on the 4 elements of lasting leadership, and one of those elements was how can we create more time? Because if you are able to, then you're able to have time to process, have time to think, have time to collaborate, have time to connect, have time to establish clarity so that you can make a decision that's not just made on a whim, that has a better chance of a higher success rate of actually lasting
Yep.
and being implemented. So with all that, let's play our last game here. This is called Final Answer. I'm going to give you a comparison, so something versus something, and you just have to pick which one, and we'll see what we end up with at the end, okay?
Okay.
Okay, so clarity versus speed.
Clarity.
Clarity versus compassion.
Compassion.
Compassion versus courage.
Compassion.
Compassion versus consistency.
Compassion.
Compassion versus trust.
Trust.
Trust versus accountability.
Trust.
Trust versus focus.
Trust.
Trust versus innovation.
Innovation.
Innovation versus resilience.
Resilience.
And resilience versus legacy.
Resilience.
There we go. So resilience appears to be our most important thing. And I want to know before we wrap up today and get into the question left for you from my last guest, why resilience?
Because I think that any change or any leadership role you play, anything in life, you're going to fall down. And if you're a person who can't get back up and doesn't have resilience to stay the course, to weather the bumps, you're doomed to fail. And so I think, resilience is important. And I do have to say your games are very hard. It's hard to just pick. So I like them, but they're hard.
They're a nice way to get people thinking. And they're usually first in the segment and I've been doing them last. I think I need to do them first again because it sets up the conversation nicely for that segment.
Yeah.
Lisa, at the very start, I said the one takeaway I want people to get from this is real change starts in the brain. Now, that might not be something that people hear and actually go, okay, that sounds great. I'm going to remember that and action that for the rest of my life. What would be the one thing you're hoping people have taken away from this conversation?
I really hope that what they recognize is that the policies shape change, but people make change. And in order to make people want to change, you have to understand how people work so that your policies are human driven. And if you create human driven policies that recognize the impact and the stressors and the needs of the people that are going to make those changes, you will be so much more successful.
Lisa, our previous guest left you a question not knowing who you were, when we were going to talk, and what conversation we were going to have. The question left for you was when you think back, what was a moment? When you think back, what was that moment that pushed you forward in your first step of leadership? And if you could do it again, would you take a bigger leap?
I think my foray into leadership was when I had a great principal. She left, and then we had a really ineffective principal. And I started to recognize the power that leadership had on my colleagues. I had a great staff. We were a staff that just did what we needed to do for kids. We worked together, we collaborated. The lunchroom was a fun place to be. People smiled. This new leader came in who was not equipped to be a leader, and the same people became whiny, nasty, backstabbing, I don't want to be here, counting the days till retirement people. So I watched the value of the people in the system decline rapidly from leadership, and that really got me interested in becoming a leader and studying leadership and understanding how I can help equip leaders, because the system is strong because of the people who are in it.
And what is a question you would like to leave for my next guest, not knowing who they are when we're going to have a conversation?
Um, I think it would be what 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 experiences have they had where they have been able to take somebody who is a serious resistor and turn them into a cheerleader and ally? How did they do it?
Okay, I will make sure that that makes their way to them. Lisa, if somebody wants to work with you or learn from you further, where should they start?
So they can get me on LinkedIn. Just look up my name on LinkedIn. I have a website, lisariegel.com. And then I also have one that's more education facing, because I also work in private sector. That's EP, like Edward Paul Institute, epinstitute.net. And then my books are available on Amazon. So if you just look up my name on Amazon, I have 3 books that are up there right now. One is Aspirations to Operations. That's the leader's guide. The other one's called NeuroWell, and that really gets more into how to build a culture for kids. So it's more of a teacher-focused operational book on how to, routines and teaching and relationship building that help kids be happier, healthier, and successful. And then I have a parent engagement book that's called Stop Doing What Doesn't Work. And so really they're all about the sort of same thing, about the human factor in organizations, and how by understanding that we can be so much more successful at achieving our organizational goals.
And if you're listening, all of that is linked in the description of this episode. Lisa, it's been my pleasure to sit and connect with you for the last hour and hear your story, hear how you're leading. And I just wanted to say thank you very much.
Thank you. I've really enjoyed this. Your podcast is very different than others, and I appreciate it, and it was really fun.